Close your eyes and imagine a land so vast that it could swallow entire countries. A place where the horizon stretches forever, where the sky meets earth in an endless dance of possibility. Now open them. You're standing in Texas, but which Texas? The one carved from wilderness by desperate dreamers and defiant rebels? Or the one that rises today as a gleaming titan of the modern world, its cities glittering like constellations against the prairie night? This is the story of the most dramatic transformation in American history. This is the story of how a wild, unforgiving frontier became the empire of tomorrow. This is Texas then and now, then the untamed empire, the land before dreams. In the beginning, there was only the land. Endless, brutal, magnificent land, stretching across nearly 300,000 square miles. The territory that would become Texas was a world unto itself, bigger than France, larger than any European nation, so massive that a man could ride for weeks and never see the same horizon twice. This was no gentle country waiting to be settled. This was a land that tested every soul who dared to claim it. Stand on the Llano Estacado in the 1800s, and you would see nothing but grass and ocean of it, rolling in waves beneath relentless wind. The Comanche called this home, and they ruled it with such fierce mastery that Spanish conquistadors, who had toppled empires in Mexico, turned back rather than face them. To the east, piney woods stretched thick and dark, where humidity hung like curtains and mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. To the south, thorny mesquite and prickly pear defended every inch of earth, and rattlesnakes coiled in the shade of rocks that burned hot enough to sear flesh. And to the west, the mountains rose like ancient gods, their peaks catching the last light of day while darkness already claimed the valleys below. This was Texas before it was Texas. This was land that belonged to whoever was strong enough to hold it. The first European eyes to see this territory belonged to Spanish explorers in the 1500s. They came seeking gold, seeking glory, seeking the mythical cities of Cibola, where streets were supposedly paved with precious metals. What they found instead was hardship, heat, and hostile resistance from people who had no interest in European gods or European kings. The Spanish tried to claim Texas anyway, building missions with high walls and Catholic bells, attempting to convert and control the native populations. Most of these missions failed. The land was too big, the distances too vast, the native peoples too determined to remain free. For 300 years, Texas existed as a distant outpost of the Spanish Empire, then the Mexican Republic. It was a place of small settlements scattered like islands in an ocean of wilderness. San Antonio grew around the missions, its Plaza de Armas a gathering place for soldiers and priests, merchants and farmers. A few thousand souls clung to the banks of rivers, the Rio Grande, the Brazos, the Colorado, the Trinity, because water meant life. And away from water there was only dust and death, the impresarios and the dream merchants. Everything changed when Stephen F. Austin arrived in 1821. He came with a contract from the Mexican government to grant of land so enormous it defied imagination. His mission was simple and impossible: bring American settlers to Texas, transform wilderness into civilization, make the desert bloom. He became what the Spanish called an impresario, a dream merchant, selling hope to anyone desperate or daring enough to chase it. They came. God, how they came. From Tennessee and Kentucky, from Alabama and Arkansas, from the played-out cotton fields of Georgia and the crowded cities of the East. They came in wagons loaded with everything they owned: plows and rifles, Bibles and butter churns, children and chickens, and an unshakable belief that here, in this savage place, they could build something better. They were farmers and blacksmiths, lawyers and laborers, preachers and prostitutes, slaveholders and men running from debts they could never repay. They were Americans, and they brought America with them. The Mexican government watched this flood of immigration with growing alarm. By 1830, American settlers outnumbered Mexican citizens in Texas by more than 3-to-1. These newcomers paid lip service to Mexican law. They converted to Catholicism on paper, swore loyalty to Mexico in official documents, but everyone knew the truth. They spoke English. They brought slaves despite Mexico's abolition of slavery, and they looked not to Mexico City but to Washington for their ultimate loyalty. Tensions simmered like heat waves rising from sun-baked earth. The Mexican government tried to stop the immigration. They passed laws, they sent troops, they demanded compliance. The settlers ignored them. By 1835, the situation had become a powder keg waiting for a spark. the revolution and the birth of a nation. That spark came in the form of a fight over a cannon. In the town of Gonzales, when Mexican soldiers arrived to confiscate a small artillery piece, the settlers refused. They raised a flag with words that would echo through history. "Come and take it." The Mexican soldiers tried. They failed. And the Texas Revolution exploded into existence. What happened next has been told and retold so many times that it has passed from history into legend. William Travis and his men trapped in the Alamo, its walls crumbling under cannon fire, knowing death was coming but refusing to surrender. Jim Bowie, the knife fighter from Louisiana, lying sick in his bed and still fighting when Mexican soldiers finally breached the walls. Davy Crockett, the frontiersman from Tennessee, making his last stand in the early morning darkness of March 6, 1836. All of them died. Every defender of the Alamo was killed, their bodies burned on pyres that sent smoke rising into the Texas sky like prayers to an indifferent heaven. 3 weeks later at Goliad, another massacre. James Fannin and his men had surrendered with the promise of fair treatment. Instead, they were marched out of the fort and executed. More than 300 men shot down in cold blood, their bodies left where they fell. The message from General Santa Anna was clear. There would be no mercy for rebels, no quarter for those who defied Mexico. But Santa Anna had made a fatal mistake. He had given the Texas rebels something more powerful than cannons or cavalry. He had given them martyrs. "Remember the Alamo" became the battle cry. "Remember Goliad" became the promise of vengeance. Sam Houston understood what history demanded. The old soldier who had lived with Cherokee Indians and served as governor of Tennessee before arriving in Texas knew that sometimes you had to retreat to advance, fall back to strike forward. He led the Texas Army eastward, away from Mexican forces, drilling his men, waiting for the right moment. Santa Anna pursued, confident of crushing the rebellion once and for all. The moment came on April 21, 1836 at San Jacinto. In 18 minutes of furious violence, a battle so short and brutal that it seemed less like warfare than butchery, the Texas Army destroyed the Mexican force. They caught Santa Anna's men during their afternoon siesta, asleep and unprepared, and what followed was not so much a battle as a massacre. The Texans, remembering the Alamo and Goliad, gave no quarter. They killed and kept killing even as Mexican soldiers tried to surrender, even as they begged for mercy in Spanish that few Texans understood or cared to understand. Santa Anna himself was captured the next day, found hiding in the tall grass wearing a common soldier's uniform. Brought before Sam Houston, who lay wounded beneath an oak tree, the self-proclaimed Napoleon of the West signed away Texas. With a few strokes of a pen, he recognized Texas independence and agreed to withdraw all Mexican forces south of the Rio Grande. The Republic of Texas was born in blood and fire. It existed as an independent nation for 9 years, the only state in America that was once a sovereign country. It had its own president, its own Congress, its own flag with a single star, and its own massive debts. Most importantly, it had its own identity, forged in revolution and unlike anything else in North America, building a republic from nothing. The early years of the republic were chaos barely contained. The new nation had no money, no credit, and enemies on all sides. Mexico refused to recognize independence and threatened invasion. Comanche warriors conducted raids that could strike hundreds of miles into settled territory, burning homesteads and taking captives. The national treasury was empty, so the government paid soldiers and officials in land millions of acres granted with such careless generosity that sorting out the overlapping claims would take generations. Houston, the temporary capital, was nothing more than a muddy collection of tents and log cabins on the banks of Buffalo Bayou. When it rained, which it did often, the streets became rivers of brown water and deeper mud. Pigs ran wild through the town, and more than one congressional session was interrupted by livestock wandering into the meeting hall. Politicians gave speeches while standing in mud that reached their ankles, debated the future of the nation while fighting off mosquitoes that carried yellow fever and malaria. But even in this chaos, something remarkable was happening. People kept coming. The population of Texas doubled, then doubled again. Settlers pushed westward into Comanche territory, establishing towns with names like Austin and San Marcos, Fredericksburg and San Saba. They built homes from whatever materials they could find: log cabins in the forested east, adobe houses in the arid west, dugouts carved into hillsides on the barren plains. They planted corn and cotton, raised cattle and horses, and slowly, painfully began to impose order on wilderness. The German immigrants who arrived in the 1840s brought with them old world skills and discipline. They founded entire towns, New Braunfels, Born, comfort where you could hear German spoken in the streets and taste beer brewed according to ancient Bavarian recipes. They built stone houses that still stand today, solid as fortresses, beautiful as churches. The plantation owners who migrated from the Deep South brought something else: slavery. By 1845, nearly 30,000 enslaved people lived in Texas, working cotton fields that stretched from the Red River to the Gulf Coast. The Republic of Texas had embraced slavery from the beginning, enshrining it in their constitution. And as the state grew, so did this peculiar institution. Wealth was measured in land and labor, and the largest plantations counted their slaves by the hundreds, joining the Union and facing war. In December of 1845, Texas became the 28th state in the American Union. The decision was controversial and consequential. Northern states opposed it because Texas was a slave state, and its admission tipped the delicate balance between free and slave states. Mexico still claimed Texas as its own territory, and American annexation was seen as an act of war. President James Polk welcomed both outcomes. He wanted Texas, and he wanted war with Mexico because he wanted California and New Mexico too. He got his war. It lasted less than 2 years but redrew the map of North America. When it ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, Mexico had lost half its territory, and the United States had gained the entire Southwest. Texas's borders were finally settled, though the state had to surrender its claims to parts of what would become New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Wyoming in exchange for $10 million from the federal government. For a brief moment, Texas seemed poised for prosperity and peace. The state's population approached 200,000. Towns were growing into cities. Cotton was king, and Texas had millions of acres perfect for growing it. Cattle grazed across the prairies in vast, uncountable herds. The future looked bright. Then came 1861, and everything changed again. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, Texas faced a choice that would define the next century. The state's economy depended on slavery, but many Texans had come from the North and felt no loyalty to the Confederacy. Sam Houston, now serving as governor, opposed secession. He argued passionately that leaving the Union would lead to disaster, that Texas should remain neutral if it couldn't stay loyal. The people ignored him. In February of 1861, Texas voted to join the Confederate States of America. Houston refused to swear allegiance to the Confederacy and was removed from office. He retired to Huntsville, a broken old man who had fought to create Texas and now watched it tear itself apart. The Civil War devastated Texas in ways both immediate and lasting. More than 60,000 Texans served in Confederate armies, fighting in battles from Virginia to Tennessee. Thousands never returned. Those who did came back to a state transformed by defeat, its economy shattered, its labor system destroyed, its people bitter and divided. The port of Galveston, which had been the most important city in Texas and one of the richest in the South, fell to Union forces and never fully recovered its pre-war prominence. Reconstruction brought federal troops and forced changes that many white Texans resented for generations. Formerly enslaved people were now citizens, and they voted, held office, and demanded rights that had been denied them. Violence erupted across the state as white Texans used terror and intimidation to maintain control. The Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations murdered black elected officials, burned black schools and churches, and enforced a system of racial oppression that would endure long after the last federal soldiers left. The frontier closes and the oil age dawns. As the 19th century entered its final decades, the Texas frontier slowly closed. The last great Comanche war chief, Quanah Parker, surrendered in 1875. And with him went the last real resistance to settlement of the Western Plains. The buffalo herds that had numbered in the millions were hunted to near extinction, sometimes for their hides, sometimes just for sport, often as a deliberate strategy to destroy the Indians' way of life. By 1880, fewer than 1,000 buffalo remained alive in all of Texas. With the Indians removed and the buffalo gone, ranchers claimed the open range. The great cattle drives began, legendary journeys where cowboys pushed herds of longhorns north to Kansas railheads, following trails with names like the Chisholm and the Goodnight Loving. These drives lasted 3 to 4 months, covered 1,000 miles or more, and turned cattle worth $3 a head in Texas into animals worth $30 or more in northern markets. The era of the cowboy, that mythical figure who would come to symbolize Texas more than any other, lasted barely 2 decades. By the 1880s, barbed wire was cutting up the open range, railroads were reaching into every corner of the state, and the old ways were dying. The last years of the 1800s saw Texas transform once again. Population surged past 3 million. Cities like Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Fort Worth grew from rough frontier towns into centers of commerce and culture. The railroads connected Texas to the rest of America, making it possible to ship products, cotton, cattle, grain, lumber to markets across the nation and the world. Farmers pushed into the dry western reaches of the state, breaking sod that had never known a plow, planting wheat and cotton in soil that would blow away in dust storms just a few decades later. Then came January 10, 1901, and everything changed one more time. At Spindletop near Beaumont, a drilling crew struck oil. The well blew wild, shooting a geyser of crude oil 100 feet into the air. It took 9 days to bring it under control, and by that time the well was producing more than 100,000 barrels a day more oil than all the other wells in America combined. The Texas oil boom had begun, and with it came the modern age. Turning point, the transformation begins. Black gold and the birth of modern Texas. The oil that erupted from Spindletop that January morning did more than make a few men rich. It transformed Texas from an agricultural frontier into an industrial powerhouse. Within months, thousands of people descended on the Beaumont area. Speculators bought and sold land at astronomical prices. Derricks rose from the prairie like a forest of steel. Towns appeared overnight, rough collections of tents and shacks where fortunes were made and lost before breakfast. The population of Beaumont exploded from 10,000 to 50,000 in a matter of months. But Spindletop was just the beginning. Oil was found in every region of the state near Houston, outside Dallas, in the Permian Basin of West Texas. Each new discovery brought a new boom. Farmers who had struggled for years suddenly became millionaires. Men who arrived with nothing but hope and a good nose for geology built empires. The Texas company, later Texaco, was founded to exploit Spindletop's riches. Gulf Oil, Humble Oil, and dozens of other companies rose to prominence during these early oil years. The money that flowed from Texas oil fields changed everything. Cities grew skyward as oil wealth financed the construction of skyscrapers that rivaled those in New York and Chicago. Houston, once a sleepy port town, exploded into a metropolis. Dallas transformed from a cotton market into a banking and business center. Even small towns felt the impact: better roads, better schools, electric lights where there had been only darkness. The oil boom also brought problems that would haunt Texas for decades. The early oil fields were disasters waiting to happen. Fires burned out of control. Wells blew wild, and entire communities lived under clouds of oil field pollution. Workers died in accidents that were brutal and common. The boom and bust cycle of the oil industry meant that towns could grow rich overnight and go bust just as quickly when the wells ran dry or the price of oil collapsed. The Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. The 1930s brought suffering to Texas on a scale the state had never known. The stock market crash of 1929 plunged the nation into depression, and Texas, like everywhere else, felt the pain. Banks failed, taking people's life savings with them. Cotton prices collapsed to 5 cents a pound, less than the cost of growing it. Unemployment soared. Families who had worked the same land for generations lost everything to banks that foreclosed on their farms and ranches. Then the weather turned against Texas. The Panhandle and West Texas, where farmers had plowed up millions of acres of prairie grass to plant wheat, became a hell on earth. Without the grass to hold the soil in place and with drought drying everything to dust, the land simply blew away. Dust storms, called black rollers because they appeared on the horizon like massive black walls swept across the plains. These storms could be hundreds of feet high and hundreds of miles wide, blotting out the sun and turning day into midnight darkness. The dust got into everything: homes, food, lungs. Children died from dust pneumonia. Animals suffocated. Entire farms disappeared beneath drifting dunes of soil. Thousands of families gave up and left, loading everything they owned into broken-down trucks and cars and heading west to California, where they were called Ockies and treated like invaders even though many came from Texas. Those who stayed learned to tie wet rags over their faces, seal windows and doors with tape and cloth, and endure. The Dust Bowl lasted nearly a decade, and it taught Texas a hard lesson about the limits of what humans could demand from the land. World War II and the military boom. The Second World War pulled Texas out of the Depression and into a new era. The federal government poured billions of dollars into the state, building military bases, aircraft factories, and shipyards. Texas's geography made it perfect for military training. The weather was good year-round. The land was cheap and plentiful, and the state was far from any possible enemy attack. Bases sprouted across the state: Fort Hood, Fort Bliss, Lackland Air Force Base, and dozens more. These installations brought thousands of soldiers and their families, and many of them stayed after the war ended, making Texas their home. The war also brought industry to Texas on a massive scale. Consolidated Aircraft built bombers in Fort Worth. Houston shipyards produced naval vessels. Refineries worked around the clock to produce aviation fuel for Allied planes. Women took jobs in factories and offices, doing work that had been reserved for men. The state's population grew by more than 1 million during the war years, and for the first time in its history, more Texans lived in cities than on farms. When the war ended in 1945, Texas stood at a crossroads. The state had the money, the infrastructure, and the population to become something truly great, but only if Texans were willing to change, to move beyond the old ways and embrace a future that looked very different from the past. The oil boom returns and the rise of big money. The 1950s brought another oil boom to Texas, this time even bigger than the first. New discoveries in the Permian Basin and off the Gulf Coast made Texas the center of the world's oil industry. Fortunes that made the old cattle barons look poor were made by men like H.L. Hunt and Clint Murchison, whose wealth was measured not in millions but in billions. These oil tycoons built mansions, collected art, owned sports teams, and wielded political power that extended far beyond Texas. The petroleum industry reshaped the Texas economy and culture. Houston became the unofficial oil capital of the world, home to hundreds of energy companies and the Houston Petroleum Club, where deals worth more than the GDP of small nations were negotiated over lunch. The city spread outward in all directions, swallowing prairie and swampland, building suburbs connected by freeways that seemed to multiply like living things. By 1960, metropolitan Houston had more than 1 million residents, and the growth showed no signs of slowing. Dallas experienced its own transformation, becoming a center for banking, insurance, and fashion. The city cultivated a sophisticated image that contrasted with Houston's rough-and-tumble oil culture. Neiman Marcus, the luxury department store founded in Dallas in 1907, became a symbol of Texas wealth and style. The city's skyline rose with glass and steel towers that reflected the ambition and confidence of post-war America, civil rights, and the struggle for justice. But beneath all this prosperity, Texas faced a reckoning with its history of racial injustice. The civil rights movement forced white Texans to confront the reality that Black Americans and Mexican Americans had been systematically denied their rights for generations. Schools remained segregated despite the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. Public facilities were divided by race. Voting was restricted by poll taxes and intimidation. Mexican-American farm workers faced exploitation and discrimination that kept them in poverty despite their vital role in the agricultural economy. The struggle for civil rights in Texas was often quiet compared to the dramatic confrontations in Alabama and Mississippi, but it was no less important. In El Paso and San Antonio, Mexican-American activists fought against school segregation. In Houston and Dallas, Black students staged sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. In the Rio Grande Valley, farm workers organized unions and demanded fair wages. The Texas Rangers, once celebrated as legendary lawmen, were exposed for their brutal treatment of Mexican Americans during labor disputes. Progress came slowly, grudgingly, and incompletely. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 brought legal changes, but social attitudes took longer to shift. Integration was often met with resistance. White Texans fled cities for suburbs, taking their tax dollars with them and leaving urban schools struggling. Mexican-American children continued to face discrimination even after formal segregation ended. The legacy of these injustices would shape Texas politics and society for the rest of the century. The space age comes to Texas. November 22, 1963, brought the world's eyes to Texas for the worst possible reason. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, shot while riding in a motorcade through Dealey Plaza. The images of that day, the president slumping in the limousine, his wife in her blood-stained pink suit. The chaos and confusion were seared into American consciousness. Lee Harvey Oswald, arrested for the murder, was himself shot and killed 2 days later on live television by Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby. The assassination became one of the defining moments of the 20th century, and Dallas bore the stigma of being the city where a president died. But just a few years earlier, in 1961, something else had happened that would ultimately define Texas's future even more than that terrible day in November. NASA chose Houston as the location for its manned spacecraft center, later renamed the Johnson Space Center. The decision brought the space age to Texas in concrete form. NASA built a massive complex southeast of Houston, creating thousands of jobs for engineers, scientists, and technicians. Houston became the first word spoken from the moon when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed there in July of 1969. The space program transformed Houston from an oil city into a technology hub. The engineering talent that came to work on the Apollo program stayed and started companies. Universities expanded their science and engineering programs to meet demand. The city developed a culture of innovation and ambition that complemented its oil industry roots. By the 1970s, Houston's economy was the most diversified in Texas, and the city's growth showed no signs of slowing. The modern economy takes shape. The 1970s and 80s saw Texas's economy evolve beyond oil and agriculture. Technology companies set up operations in Austin, drawn by the University of Texas and the city's quality of life. Dell Computer, founded by Michael Dell in his university dorm room in 1984, grew into a global giant and helped establish Austin as a technology center. Other tech companies followed, and by the 90s, Austin was calling itself the Silicon Hills, a deliberate comparison to California's Silicon Valley. Dallas and Houston continued to grow as business centers. American Airlines chose Dallas-Fort Worth as its headquarters. Continental Airlines was based in Houston. Banks, law firms, and corporate headquarters clustered in the city's downtowns, which were being rebuilt with ever-taller skyscrapers. The suburban sprawl that had begun in the 1950s accelerated, with new developments pushing farther and farther from city centers. But the oil boom and bust cycle continued to dominate the Texas economy. When oil prices soared in the 1970s due to the OPEC oil embargo, Texas prospered. Money flowed into the state like water, and Houston briefly passed Philadelphia to become the fourth largest city in America. But when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, the crash was devastating. Banks failed by the dozens. The savings and loan crisis hit Texas particularly hard. For sale signs sprouted across Houston like weeds. The state's economy, still too dependent on oil, had to learn painful lessons about diversification and resilience. Immigration and the changing face of Texas. Throughout the late 20th century, immigration from Mexico and Latin America continued to reshape Texas. The border was increasingly crossed by people seeking economic opportunity, fleeing violence, or reuniting with family. Some came legally, some didn't, but all came seeking a better life. They took jobs in construction, agriculture, service industries, and domestic work. They opened restaurants and shops, started businesses, bought homes, and sent their children to schools. By the 1990s, Texas was becoming majority-minority, meaning that non-white residents would soon outnumber white residents. This demographic shift had profound implications for politics, culture, and society. Spanish was spoken in homes across the state. Quinceañeras celebrated girls' 15th birthdays with elaborate parties that rivaled weddings. Mexican and Tex-Mex food became as fundamental to Texas cuisine as barbecue. The Virgin of Guadalupe appeared on murals and in home shrines. Texas was becoming something new, not quite Mexico, not quite traditional America, but a hybrid culture that drew from both. This change wasn't always smooth. Immigration became a contentious political issue, with some Texans welcoming newcomers and others demanding tighter border security. English-only movements tried to restrict the use of Spanish in schools and government. Racial tensions simmered and sometimes exploded into conflict, but the demographic transformation was inevitable and unstoppable. The Texas of the 21st century would be far more diverse than the Texas of the past. The turn of the millennium. As the 20th century ended, Texas stood as one of the great success stories of American history. A state that had been an agricultural frontier just 100 years earlier was now the second largest state in population and the second largest in economy. If Texas were an independent nation, it would rank among the top 15 economies in the world. The state's cities were global centers of energy, technology, medicine, and finance. Houston's Texas Medical Center had become the largest medical complex in the world, with hospitals and research institutions that attracted patients and scientists from around the globe. The University of Texas system educated hundreds of thousands of students across multiple campuses. The Port of Houston was one of the busiest in America. Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport served millions of passengers a year, but challenges remained. Texas had some of the worst air pollution in the nation, particularly in Houston and Dallas. The state's schools, despite pockets of excellence, ranked near the bottom nationally in many measures. Income inequality was growing, with vast wealth concentrated in the hands of a few while millions of Texans struggled to make ends meet. The border remained a source of conflict and controversy. Still, as Texas entered the 21st century, optimism prevailed. The state had overcome so much, had transformed itself so completely that anything seemed possible. The spirit of the frontier, the belief that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, remained alive. Texas had been reborn multiple times in its history. Now it stood ready to be reborn again. Now the empire of tomorrow, Texas in 2026. Stand in downtown Houston today, and you can barely see the sky. Glass towers rise 60, 70, 80 stories, catching the sun and throwing it back in blinding sheets of reflected light. The streets hum with activity, construction cranes dotting the skyline like mechanical birds. Traffic flowing in rivers of steel and glass. People from every nation on earth walking the sidewalks. This is the fourth largest city in America, home to more than 2.3 million people within the city limits, and more than 7 million in the greater metropolitan area. This is the energy capital of the world, the medical center of the South, a place where fortunes are made and lost every day in boardrooms 1,000 feet above the ground. Texas in 2026 is a state transformed beyond anything its founders could have imagined. With a population approaching 32 million people, Texas has more residents than all but 4 nations in Europe. If Texas were still an independent country, it would be the 8th or 9th largest economy on Earth, larger than Brazil, larger than Italy, larger than Canada. The state's gross domestic product exceeds $2.4 trillion, driven by energy, technology, manufacturing, agriculture, and trade. But numbers only tell part of the story. To understand modern Texas, you have to see it, feel it, breathe it. You have to watch the sun rise over the piney woods of East Texas, where the trees still grow thick and green, where small towns wake to the sound of church bells and the smell of breakfast being cooked in cafes that have served the same families for generations. You have to stand in the Permian Basin as sunset paints the oil derricks gold, where pump jacks bob up and down like mechanical prayers, where the earth still gives up its treasure even after more than a century of drilling. You have to walk the river walk in San Antonio on a warm evening, past restaurants and shops built into buildings that are 300 years old, where the past and present exist side by side and tourists from around the world come to experience a piece of old Texas that's been carefully preserved and cleverly commercialized. The great cities rise. Houston has become something that would have seemed impossible a century ago, a truly global city, connected to every corner of the world by trade, by immigration, by culture, by ideas. The Port of Houston, which stretches for 50 miles along the Houston Ship Channel, is the busiest port in America measured by tonnage. Container ships from China, oil tankers from the Middle East, grain vessels from South America, they all come to Houston, drawn by the city's strategic location and world-class infrastructure. The port supports more than 1 million jobs and generates billions in economic activity. But Houston's influence extends far beyond petroleum and shipping. The Texas Medical Center has grown into an empire of healing, with more than 60 institutions, including some of the world's finest hospitals and research facilities. MD Anderson Cancer Center treats patients from every continent. Texas Children's Hospital is one of the largest pediatric hospitals anywhere. The medical center employs more than 100,000 people and conducts research that pushes the boundaries of what's medically possible. When someone in Singapore or Dubai or London faces a complex medical problem, they often end up in Houston. The Johnson Space Center continues to drive innovation, though its role has evolved. NASA still trains astronauts here and operates mission control for the International Space Station. But now private space companies like SpaceX have major operations in Texas. The space industry has spawned an ecosystem of aerospace firms, satellite companies, and technology startups. Houston is positioning itself to be the center of the commercial space industry as humanity begins its expansion beyond Earth. Dallas has become the financial and corporate heart of Texas. The city's downtown bristles with the headquarters of major corporations at AMT, Southwest Airlines, and dozens more. The Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area, with more than 8 million people, is the fourth largest in the nation. The Metroplex, as locals call it, sprawls across thousands of square miles of vast expanse of suburbs, office parks, shopping centers, and highways that seem to stretch forever. The traffic is legendary and terrible, a daily test of patience for millions of commuters. But Dallas offers something that Houston lacks: a sense of style, of sophistication, of cultural refinement. The Dallas Arts District is the largest urban arts district in America, home to world-class museums, theaters, and concert halls. The city has cultivated an image as a place where business gets done but where culture matters too. Fashion, design, and architecture thrive here. The restaurants can compete with those in New York or San Francisco. Dallas wants to be seen not just as a successful city but as an important one, a place that matters beyond its economic statistics. Austin, once a sleepy college town, has exploded into one of America's most dynamic cities. The population has more than doubled since the turn of the century, surging past 1.2 million in the city proper and approaching 3 million in the metro area. The city's unofficial motto, "Keep Austin Weird," has become increasingly ironic as growth and development transform the city into something more conventional. But the tech industry boom has been extraordinary. Tesla built a massive factory here. Oracle moved its headquarters to Austin. Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, every major tech company has a significant presence. The jobs are high-paying, the workers are young and educated, and property values have soared to levels that would have seemed absurd 20 years ago. San Antonio has preserved more of its history than any other major Texas city. The Alamo still stands in the heart of downtown, though now it's dwarfed by hotels and office buildings. The Spanish missions along the San Antonio River have been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The city has become a major tourist destination, drawing millions of visitors each year who want to experience authentic Texas history. But San Antonio is more than its past, it's also a military city, home to Joint Base San Antonio, one of the largest military installations in the world. The military presence shapes the city's culture and economy, providing stability even as other sectors fluctuate. The border and its complexities. The Texas-Mexico border stretches for more than 1,200 miles, from El Paso in the west to Brownsville in the east. This border is one of the most crossed in the world, with hundreds of millions of dollars in trade flowing north and south every day. But it's also one of the most controversial and contested boundaries on Earth. The border cities El Paso, Laredo, McAllen, Brownsville are neither fully American nor fully Mexican, but something in between. Spanish and English mix in conversation, sometimes within the same sentence. Families have relatives on both sides of the Rio Grande. Culture flows back and forth like the river itself. These cities are among the poorest in Texas, with poverty rates that shock people from other parts of the state, but they're also among the safest, with crime rates lower than most American cities of similar size. Immigration remains the defining issue of the border. Since 2000, millions of people have crossed into Texas illegally, most seeking economic opportunity or fleeing violence in Central America and Mexico. The immigration debate has become increasingly polarized and bitter. Some Texans advocate for compassion and legal pathways to citizenship. Others demand stricter enforcement and border barriers. The Trump administration built hundreds of miles of border wall in Texas, dividing communities and sparking legal battles. The Biden administration reversed many Trump-era policies but faced criticism for its handling of a surge in border crossings. In 2026, the border issue remains unresolved. Detention centers house thousands of migrants awaiting asylum hearings that can take years. Border Patrol agents work long hours in difficult conditions, trying to manage an impossible situation. Humanitarian organizations provide food, water, and shelter to people who have risked everything for a chance at a better life. The border is a place of hope and desperation, opportunity and tragedy, where the dream of America confronts the reality of limited resources and political will. The energy transition. Texas remains the energy capital of America, producing more oil and natural gas than any other state. The Permian Basin alone produces more than 5 million barrels of oil per day, more than most countries. The state's refineries process crude into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and petrochemicals. Natural gas from Texas fields heats homes and generates electricity across the nation. The oil and gas industry employs hundreds of thousands of Texans directly and supports hundreds of thousands more jobs indirectly. But the energy landscape is changing in ways that would have been unimaginable just 20 years ago. Texas has become the national leader in wind energy, with vast wind farms covering the plains of West Texas. The turbines, their blades as long as football fields, spin day and night, generating electricity that flows into the state's power grid. Solar farms are sprouting in the sunny expanses of South and West Texas, acres of panels that convert sunlight into power. By 2026, renewable energy accounts for nearly a third of Texas's electricity generation, and that percentage is growing every year. This transition hasn't been smooth. The Texas power grid, which operates independently from the rest of the nation, failed catastrophically in February of 2021 when a severe winter storm knocked out power for millions of Texans. Hundreds of people died from cold, carbon monoxide poisoning, and other storm-related causes. The disaster exposed serious flaws in the state's energy infrastructure and sparked a political firestorm. Since then, the grid has been upgraded and winterized, but questions remain about its ability to handle extreme weather events that are becoming more frequent due to climate change. The political debate over energy policy reflects deeper divisions within Texas. The oil and gas industry wants to protect its dominance and resists regulations that might limit drilling or emissions. Environmental advocates push for faster adoption of renewable energy and stronger climate action. The conflict plays out in the state legislature, in regulatory agencies, and in courtrooms. Meanwhile, the market is making its own decisions. Renewable energy is increasingly cost-competitive with fossil fuels, and companies are investing billions in wind and solar projects not because of government mandates, but because it makes economic sense. Technology and innovation. Austin's transformation into a technology hub has spread to other Texas cities. Dallas has attracted cybersecurity firms and telecom companies. Houston's energy expertise is being applied to developing cleaner technologies and carbon capture systems. San Antonio has become a center for military technology and artificial intelligence research. Across the state, universities are partnering with private companies to commercialize research and train the next generation of engineers and scientists. The technology sector has brought wealth but also challenges. Housing prices have soared in Austin and Dallas, pricing out longtime residents and creating affordability crises. Traffic congestion has worsened as roads struggle to keep pace with population growth. The influx of highly paid tech workers has widened income inequality and sparked resentment from people who feel left behind by the new economy. Texas has also become a battleground in the national debate over artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency, and other emerging technologies. The state's relatively light regulatory touch has attracted companies looking to innovate without excessive government oversight. Bitcoin mining operations have set up in Texas, drawn by cheap electricity and friendly regulations. AI firms are building data centers to train large language models. The question is whether Texas can nurture innovation while avoiding the pitfalls that have afflicted Silicon Valley: runaway costs, traffic nightmares, and growing inequality. The culture wars. Texas politics have always been intense, but in recent years the temperature has risen to levels not seen since the Civil War era. The state has become a focal point in national culture wars over abortion, gun rights, immigration, education, and LGBTQ rights. Republican control of the state government has produced legislation that conservatives celebrate and progressives denounce. The state banned abortion after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022. Constitutional carry laws allow Texans to carry handguns without permits or training. Books dealing with race, sexuality, and gender have been removed from school libraries. These policies have made Texas a symbol of conservative resistance to progressive cultural change. But Texas is not monolithic. The major cities lean Democratic while rural areas remain overwhelmingly Republican. Hispanic voters, once reliably Democratic, are increasingly split between the parties. Young Texans hold different views than their parents on issues like climate change, marijuana legalization, and social justice. The state is changing demographically and culturally in ways that don't align neatly with traditional partisan divides. This political tension plays out in daily life. School boards have become arenas for fierce battles over curriculum and library books. City councils debate policies on homelessness, police funding, and housing. Neighbors who once got along now avoid talking about politics because the divisions run too deep. Texas is wrestling with fundamental questions about what kind of state it wants to be, and different Texans have very different answers. The military presence. Texas remains a military powerhouse, home to 15 active-duty military bases and numerous National Guard and Reserve installations. Fort Hood, recently renamed Fort Cavazos, is one of the largest military bases in the world, home to more than 40,000 soldiers. Joint Base San Antonio combines 3 major installations into a massive complex that trains thousands of airmen every year. Fort Bliss in El Paso is the Army's second-largest base and serves as a training center for air defense artillery. The military presence shapes Texas in profound ways. Veterans make up a significant portion of the state's population, bringing with them a culture of service and sacrifice. Defense contractors employ tens of thousands of Texans in high-paying jobs. Military families bring diversity to communities that might otherwise be demographically homogeneous. The bases contribute billions to local economies and provide stability that other industries cannot match. Education in the future. Texas faces enormous challenges in education. The state ranks near the bottom nationally in per pupil spending, yet it has some of the fastest-growing school districts in America. Teachers are underpaid and overworked, leading to shortages in critical subjects like math and science. Schools in poor communities lack resources that wealthy districts take for granted. The achievement gap between white students and Black and Hispanic students remains stubbornly wide, yet there are bright spots. The University of Texas at Austin ranks among the best public universities in the nation. Texas A&M has one of the largest university endowments in the world. Rice University, a private institution in Houston, competes with Ivy League schools in selectivity and prestige. Community colleges across the state provide affordable pathways to good jobs in fields like nursing, welding, and information technology. The state has also invested heavily in science and research. The Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas has funded cutting-edge research that's led to new treatments. The Texas Advanced Computing Center at UT Austin houses some of the most powerful supercomputers in the world. Universities across the state are conducting research on everything from nanotechnology to agricultural science, often in partnership with private companies. The changing landscape. Drive across Texas today and you'll see a landscape in transition. Oil derricks stand next to wind turbine. Cattle graze beneath solar panel. Ancient live oaks, which have watched over the land for centuries, provide shade for housing developments where families from California and New York are making new lives. The old Texas, the Texas of cowboys and cotton, small towns and Sunday church services, still exists in pockets. But it's being overwhelmed by the new Texas, diverse, urban, connected to the global economy, racing toward a future that looks very different from the past. The small towns that once dotted the countryside are struggling or dying. Young people leave for cities where jobs are plentiful and life is more exciting. Main streets are lined with empty buildings, schools close for lack of students. The agricultural economy that sustained these communities for generations can no longer support them in an era of mechanization and consolidation. Some towns have found new life as tourist destinations or retirement communities, but many are simply fading away, their populations aging and dwindling. Meanwhile, the cities keep growing. Suburbs sprawl farther into what was recently farmland. New developments rise up seemingly overnight, offering homes to people priced out of urban centers. The infrastructure struggles to keep pace. Roads are congested, water supplies are strained, schools are overcrowded. But the growth continues because people keep coming, drawn by jobs and opportunity, by the promise that has always defined Texas. The climate challenge. Texas is on the front lines of climate change. Droughts are becoming more frequent and severe, threatening the state's water supplies and agriculture. Heat waves are more intense and last longer, pushing power grids to their limits and killing people who lack air conditioning. Hurricanes are becoming wetter and more destructive. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 dumped more than 50 inches of rain on Houston, causing catastrophic flooding and more than $100 billion in damage. The state is responding, but slowly. Cities are building flood control systems and improving drainage. Water utilities are exploring new sources and conservation measures. Building codes are being updated to require more energy-efficient construction. But these efforts are piecemeal and often reactive, undertaken only after disasters strike. Texas has been reluctant to acknowledge the full scope of the climate challenge, in part because doing so might threaten the fossil fuel industry that has been so central to the state's economy. Yet reality is forcing change. Insurance companies are raising rates or pulling out of coastal areas vulnerable to hurricane. Water districts are implementing restrictions during droughts. Farmers are switching to crops that use less water. The market is already adapting to climate change, even if politicians are slow to act. The crossroads. Texas in 2026 stands at a crossroads, just as it has at so many moments in its history. The state has enormous strengths: a growing population, a diverse economy, abundant natural resources, a strategic location, and a culture that values hard work and individual initiative. But it also faces serious challenges: political polarization, infrastructure deficits, educational gaps, environmental threats, and social inequalities that threaten to undermine the Texas dream. The decisions Texans make in the coming years will determine whether the state continues its remarkable trajectory or stumbles into decline. Will Texas invest in education and infrastructure, or will it rely on low taxes and limited government? Will it embrace diversity and inclusion, or will it retreat into cultural warfare? Will it lead on climate change and renewable energy, or will it cling to fossil fuels? Will it welcome newcomers, or will it turn inward? These questions don't have easy answers. Texas has always been a place of contradictions: conservative yet entrepreneurial, traditional yet innovative, individualistic yet community-minded. These contradictions have been sources of strength, allowing Texas to adapt and evolve even as it maintains distinct identity. The challenge now is to preserve what's best about Texas while building something even better for the generations to come. Closing. From the blood-soaked ground of San Jacinto to the gleaming towers of Houston, from the dust storms of the Depression to the wind farms that now spin on those same plains, from a frontier where survival was uncertain to a global powerhouse where the future is being built, this is the story of Texas. It's a story of transformation so complete that the people who fought at the Alamo would barely recognize the state that bears the name they died defending. Yet somehow, some essential spirit remains. That restless ambition, that refusal to accept limits, that absolute conviction that tomorrow can be better than today. These things that defined Texas in 1836 still define it in 2026. Texas has been reborn again and again, reinventing itself with each generation while somehow remaining undeniably, unmistakably, forever Texas. The empire that rose from wilderness is still rising, still becoming, still dreaming bigger than seems reasonable or possible. And maybe that, in the end, is the truest thing anyone can say about Texas. It never stops becoming what it might be.